till I can't no more.
I got the horses in the bag. Horse stock is a tag.
Hi everyone and welcome to Protocol 36, and in today's video we'll be talking about how Spectacular Spider-Man came to be. So we'll be talking about the making of the show, the characters, the casting, and what the initial plans were for the show and how it became the show that we all know and love today. Since a lot of people, including myself, love to talk about the cancellation of the show and why it was cancelled in the first place, I wanted to do something different and talk about how the show was made in the first place. So if there's any point where you enjoyed the video, I would highly appreciate it if you like. Also give the channel a chance by subscribing, as I publish consistent and amazing content for you guys, and click on the notification bell in order to not miss any of my future videos. During the Sam Raimi Spider-Man era, Sony not only had the film rights to Spider-Man but also had the TV and merchandising rights of the character too. At the time, since Spider-Man was one of the most iconic heroes out there and his films were doing great, according to Michael Vogel, Marvel really wanted a Spider-Man show, but of course at the time they couldn't make one without Sony. In the early stages there was a lot of debates on who was going to run the show, since there were a lot of people that were meeting and interviewing, and even Hasbro came in to talk to Sony Consumer Products about toys. Ultimately they came to the decision to hire Greg Weisman, who worked on Gargoyles, Young Justice and more. Gargoyles was one of the reasons he was hired to work on the show. Also Victor Cook worked on a lot of Disney classics such as 101 Dalmatian, the series, Buzz Lightyear of Star Command, The Legend of Tarzan, and also worked on other projects outside of Disney such as Scooby-Doo Incorporated, Stretch Armstrong and the Flex Fighters, both of them helming the series, and Sean Galloway being the lead character designer and character supervisor, who worked as an artist in both Marvel and DC comics like Venom, Teen Titans Go, Ready for Action, and also worked on the Hellboy animated films with Victor Cook, which is awesome. It was announced on June 18th, 2007 by Kids WB Senior Vice President and General Manager that a new Spider-Man animated series was going to premiere in 2008 by Kids WB on the CW. Weisman and Cook were also assigned to the series as supervising producer and producer supervisor director respectively. When Greg was hired to work on the new Spider-Man show, he went and bought the Essential Spider-Man comics, which contained 7 volumes of the Amazing Spider-Man comics. As a kid, Weisman was a huge fan of Spider-Man and grew up with the Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. comics, and later went back to read the original Stan Lee and Steve Ditko run, which had a huge impact on the show, taking the action, drama, comedy, and of course setting the show in high school, starting in Peter's junior year, making him 16 when the show starts. The creators of the show also took inspiration from the Ultimate Spider-Man comic book run by Brian Michael Bendis, one example being Eddie Brock and Peter Parker being childhood friends, their parents being very close, ultimately dying in the plane crash, and of course Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy. This choice was made to ensure that Spider-Man would move similar to the Spider-Man from the early films. The art style of the series is more simplified than its previous incarnation, but still retained their classic elements and taken specific elements from the Lee and Ditko run, like the armpit webs, the half Peter Parker half Spider-Man face mask, which appears from time to time both in the show and the comics, the sky covered in Spider-Man's webbing and the color of his suit, and of course the spider sense, which was directly taken from Steve Ditko. Weisman has also explained that in adapting the comics for the show, the producers tried to follow what they call the 5 C's, which is contemporary, cohesive, coherent, classic, and iconic. The advantage of hindsight allowed the show to be more coherent and cohesive in the comic book continuity, so when viewers are watching, they can follow very easily. Weisman also studied all the characters, both iconic Spider-Man characters and unknown ones too, combining characters and storylines when necessary for the sake of making things easily digestible for audiences. For example, Flash Thompson being a bully who's deep down an honorable guy, while Shocker had his iconic costume but didn't have the Herman Schultz character, but instead combining the character with Montana. Other than taking classic Spider-Man characters from Peter's high school days, the crew also took characters who were introduced in Peter's college days in the comics. And when taking those characters, they were thinking about how characters like Harry Osborn, Gwen Stacy and etc. would be like in high school, and of course taking those classic characters and making it their own, but still be recognizable. For example, when looking at Vulture's updated design, you can still say, yep, that's the Vulture. Or when looking at Elektra's design, you can still go, yeah, that's Elektra. Also reflecting their New York City with the real life New York by changing some of the characters' races, but also keeping the core of said character. For example, Liz Allen, who was initially white in the comics, but in the show she's Latina. When it came to the casting, they of course started with getting the voice actor for Peter Parker / Spider-Man, viewing other auditions from other actors, and they ultimately picked Josh Keaton, which I gotta say he's fantastic as Spidey and Peter Parker. Parker, in my opinion. Eventually, they also cast Vanessa Marshall as Mary Jane Watson, James Arnold Taylor as Harry Osborn, Lacey Chabert as Gwen Stacy, Darren Norris as J. Jonah Jameson, Deborah Strang as Aunt May, and more. Also, fun fact, Uncle Ben was voiced by Ed Asner, who voiced J. Jonah Jameson in the 90s Spider-Man animated series, which is pretty awesome. Also casting the villains, Robert Englund as Adrian Toomes, aka The Vulture, John DiMaggio, who voiced both Sandman and Hammerhead, Peter McNichol as Doc Ock, Benjamin Diskin as Eddie Brock, aka Venom, Tombstone, who was voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson, except for the first episode, who was voiced by Keith David, which is interesting because he voiced Goliath in Gargoyles, and he wasn't the only actor who was brought back from Gargoyles to work on Spectacular Spider-Man. As mentioned before, Ed Asner, who played Uncle Ben, was also in Gargoyles, and you have Tham Edcox, Jeff Bennett, and Bill Fagabaki, who voiced Tinkerer, the Shocker, and Morris Bench, respectively. And finally, Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin, who was voiced by Alan Richards and Stephen Bloom, respectively. And the reason why they have two different voice actors was because so the mystery of the Green Goblin's secret identity wasn't ruined in any way, and they wanted to throw viewers off just when we thought we figured out who the Green Goblin was. It was by far one of the best decisions the creators did when making the show, and I'm glad they did that. Also, there are some that I haven't mentioned, but all of the voice actors and actresses did amazing work when it came to the respective roles, delivering performances that most fans will never forget. When pitching the show initially, a lot of changes were made for good reasons, such as Greg Weisman originally wanted Kraven the Hunter to be in Season 1, Episode 2. However, Marvel advised Weisman to put Kraven the Hunter later in the series in order to let Spider-Man become more famous for Kraven to want to come and challenge him, since at this point in the show, Peter would have been Spider-Man for around 3 months and people in the universe don't really know that much about him or seen him around, and he's just starting to get people's attention in New York, which Weisman agreed and introduced Kraven in Season 2, Episode 2, and subbed in Elektra, who they were going to do anyway. They originally, of course, wanted Kingpin to be the big man of crime, but of course, legally they couldn't because he not only became a Daredevil villain at the time, but was also used for the Daredevil movie, which was made by Fox, leading to Fox having the rights to that character, until him and Daredevil would ultimately go back to Marvel. In the show, as we saw, Tombstone pretty much took Kingpin's place, which still turned out great. And Weisman said that he has no complaints and is very happy with it regardless. He also wanted a superhero from Marvel Comics to have a guest appearance at least once every season. He did make it clear that he didn't really want the show to be about Spider-Man and another Marvel character to show up every episode, just that the show will ultimately be about Spider-Man, but once in a while a character will come in and meet Peter Parker for at least one episode. And he talked about wanting Johnny Storm to appear in Season 1 because he really liked the rivalry and friendship that Spider-Man and Human Torch had in the comics. He basically described that the entire show would have been if Marvel Comics in the early 60s were reset in 2008. So the Fantastic Four would have already been established in New York, but dealing with cosmic threats, while Peter would try and figure out his own life, dealing with common thugs and of course his classic villains, pretty much setting it in the very early days of Marvel. So according to Weisman, it would have been before Tony Stark ever put on the Iron Man suit, before Thor becoming Donald Blake and picking up the hammer. Ant-Man will still exist, but nobody would know who he is, at least to the average person. Hulk would have also been a thing, but people would write him off as if he was a myth, like a Bigfoot legend. So the Avengers pretty much wouldn't have been formed yet, and Captain America of course would still be on the ice. He also said that Uncle Ben would have been a massive Captain America fan, and when Peter would meet or discover Cap, he would see him as a connection to Uncle Ben, because in the Parker home, Uncle Ben would have stashes and items of Captain America. He also said that he would have wanted Beast and Cyclops, being the first two students in Professor X's school, to show up in one episode to recruit Spider-Man because they thought that he was a mutant. So the X-Men would have eventually became a thing, but this would have been before Iceman, Angel and Jean Grey joining, and she would have been known as Marvel Girl at the time. But of course those things didn't happen due to legal reasons and only having access to Spider-Man. But of course he said that the show hasn't suffered in any way and he's very happy with the final product. And to be honest, so am I. It definitely would have been really cool if we saw that, and either way the show turned out to be fantastic, so I'm not complaining. He also mentioned something I thought that was interesting, which was when making the show, he wasn't sure if he was going to do it, but had a vague idea that Mary Jane would have known Peter Parker was Spider-Man all this time. So when making the show, one of the notions he had was that maybe MJ, when staying with her aunt who lives next to the Parkers, might have looked out the window and she might have seen Spider-Man going into Peter Parker's window, where something similar went down in the comics, which is how Mary Jane knew. And this would have been very interesting to see see had the show gone on. Now, when creating a new show or a movie, there's a good chance that a lot of debates and conflict will occur, and Spectacular Spider-Man was no exception. Interestingly, the creators were told to cut out the line from the first episode where the Vulture was going after Norman Osborn. Peter, while being chased by the Enforcers, in his mind says, "Only one thing I know for sure. I can't let Harry lose his dad the way I lost Uncle Ben." Why exactly? I'm not really too sure, but it's probably because they probably didn't want to hint any type of death or dark elements in the show so that parents wouldn't be able to complain about it, even though it hints at his origin story. But of course they fought to keep it in the show, and I'm glad that they did. And there was also an exec who came in later when making the show, who told them to get rid of the spider webs in the sky, which would appear in the ending of each episode, being a direct callback to the Lee and Ditko comics, because he thought that kids wouldn't understand how the webs got there. And I'm serious when I say that. And was something the crew had to fight for as well. And thanks to Sheen Galloway's designs not being hyper realistic, they were able to get away with a lot of the Steve Ditko symbolisms. And one of the other things the creators had to fight for with the same exact was also Mary Jane's iconic line, which is, "Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot." And I think it's better if you hear what they have to say.
Then he got the script with that line in it, and he goes, "I don't know about that line. It makes Mary Jane seem so conceited. I don't think we'll like her if she says that. I think you need to cut that line."
Wow.
And we were like, "You think you're a Spider-Man fan?" I mean, and we were like, well, Michael, you can take over the story, because you had to explain it to him. And then he had a suggestion for a replacement line that would pay homage to it, but wouldn't make her seem so.
This was you can't say "Face it, Tiger, you hit the jackpot" on a kid's show. And I'm like, why? And he was like, "She just can't say that." And my response was, "But that's what she says." And he was like, "But no, she can't." And then it was literally like, what if she says, we're gonna have a great time, Tiger, or "Hey, Tiger." And there was all these suggestions, and I was just like,
his last thing was to give the line to Peter.
What?
Yeah.
Give the line to Peter,
like, well,
and have Peter say, "Face it, Spider, you just hit the jackpot."
Oh my god.
So yeah, it was.
That suggestion came to me, and I'm like, no.
That was the first.
Yeah, let's be glad that they didn't listen. The producer Greg Weisman has also stated that the show's theme is the education of Peter Parker. In keeping with that theme, each of the series' arc was named after courses of study. Season 1's arcs are Biology 101, Economics 101, Chemistry 101, and Psychology 101. And Season 2's are Engineering 101, Human Development 101, Criminology 101, and Drama 101, which is why each episode is named after a concept in education, making those tiny details that much more meaningful to audiences, creating a show that is still loved around the world. Greg Weisman also made sure that Peter Parker's civilian life was as exciting as his Spider-Man life, which worked beautifully, as when Peter Parker is out doing his job as Spider-Man, we wonder what type of consequence Peter Parker will have to experience after he saves the day. Not to mention, Greg Weisman had lots of love for Shakespeare and opera, not only including them in Gargoyles, but also in Spectacular Spider-Man, specifically in Gangland and Opening Night, as opera and Shakespeare played a huge part in those episodes respectively. Season 1 aired in Kids WB in 2008, and Season 2 ended up airing in Disney XD in 2009, before it was unfortunately cancelled due to Sony selling the TV rights to Disney and the merchandising rights along with that. Spectacular Spider-Man, in the end, ended up having a legacy that still continues to live on, and both Greg Weisman and Victor Cook said that their goal was to create a Spider-Man show that would be iconic, a classic, and something that will be remembered for years to come. And I think it's safe to say that they have achieved that and more. However, what about you guys? What do you think about the making of Spectacular Spider-Man? Do you think I've missed anything? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. If you enjoyed this video, please like, and want more, subscribe. To begin, Protocol 36.